We do not want Australia represented by men mainly because of the ability, natural and inborn in Jews, to push themselves forward." That's a direct quote, written in ink in a private diary in May 1918, 4 weeks before the most important command appointment in Australian military history. The man writing it was Charles Bean, Australia's official war correspondent, the man who would later write the nation's 6-volume official history of the Great War, the man whose statue stands outside the Australian War Memorial in Canberra to this day, and the man he was writing about, the man whose promotion Bean was actively conspiring to block, was Lieutenant General John Monash, a civil engineer, a militia officer, a Jew whose parents spoke German at home, a man who had never attended Camberley, never served in the regular British Army, never worn the right school tie or known the right people at the right clubs. Bean's diary sits in the Australian War Memorial Archives. Catalogue reference AWM38, 3DRL606. You can request it, you can read his handwriting, and what you'll find, scattered through the entries from late 1917 through mid-1918, is one of the most documented cases of institutional anti-Semitism in Australian military history, directed at the man who would, within weeks of Bean's scribbling, plan and execute the single most important tactical innovation of the First World War. 93 minutes. That's how long the Battle of Hamel lasted, 3 minutes over Monash's planned 90. And when it was over, the Western Front had its first fully integrated combined arms operation. Infantry, tanks, aircraft, artillery, smoke, machine guns, synchronised like instruments in an orchestra by a man half the establishment thought had no business conducting anything. Stay with me, because this story has 2 antagonists, not one. The first is British-class prejudice, the assumption that command belongs to men of the right blood, the right background, the right religion. The second walks in later, wearing American stars, and Monash beats them both. Not with argument, with results. John Monash was born in 1865 in West Melbourne. His father, Louis Monash, had arrived from Prussia, his mother Bertha from Poland. They spoke German at the dinner table. Young John grew up in a household that was Jewish, immigrant, urban, and decidedly not part of the Anglo-Celtic squattocracy that ran colonial Victoria. He studied engineering and law at the University of Melbourne, graduated in both, built bridges, patented a system for reinforced concrete construction, ran a successful engineering firm, and alongside all of it, he served in the citizen militia, the part-time soldiers that the regular military establishment viewed with something between condescension and contempt. Here's the thing about Monash that matters. He was not a warrior by temperament. He was a problem solver. When he looked at a battlefield, he didn't see glory or honour or any of the other words that Bean liked to attach to the Australian fighting spirit. He saw a system, inputs, outputs, constraints, tolerances, a problem to be optimised. By 1914, he was 49 years old. Too old, really, for what was coming. But he took command of the 4th Brigade and went to Gallipoli. And at Gallipoli, something happened that would shadow him for the rest of the war. Rumours circulated, in Cairo, in London, in Melbourne, that Monash had been arrested and shot as a German spy, entirely baseless, completely fabricated, but during a war against Germany, a man with German-speaking parents and a Jewish surname was already suspect in the minds of people who thought in those categories. The rumours were never officially investigated because there was nothing to investigate, but they lingered, they fed an atmosphere, and they made it easier, years later, for men like Bean to dress up prejudice as concern. From Gallipoli, Monash went to the Western Front. He commanded the 3rd Division from 1916. His performance improved steadily, competent at first, then genuinely impressive, drawing favourable assessments from British superiors who had no reason to flatter an Australian militia officer. Haig liked him. Birdwood, commanding the Australian Imperial Force, actively supported him. Rawlinson, his army commander, respected his planning ability and his obsessive attention to logistics. By early 1918, when the question of who would command the newly formed Australian Corps arose, the military consensus pointed clearly to Monash, but none of that mattered to Charles Bean. Bean's opposition to Monash is one of those historical episodes where the evidence is so explicit that you almost wish it were more ambiguous. Ambiguity would allow for interpretation. What Bean wrote allows for nothing except what it is. December 1917. Monash is commanding the 3rd Division competently enough that his promotion to Corps Command is being discussed. Bean writes in his diary, "His ambition makes him an underground engineer. He has the Jewish capacity of worming silently into favour without seeming to take any steps towards it." Read that again. The Jewish capacity of worming silently into favour. This is not subtext, this is text. By May 1918, when Monash's appointment was imminent, Bean escalated. He wrote that Monash was a man of very ordinary ideals, lower than ordinary, I should say, and that with his people in charge, the force would lack the high chivalrous patriotic spirit it needed. His people. The phrasing is unmistakable. Bean had an archetype in his head. The ideal Australian soldier was the Anglo-Celtic bushman, lean, laconic, bred on a sheep station somewhere west of the Divide. The ideal Australian commander was an extension of this myth, professionally trained at a British staff college, regular army through and through, a man whose authority came from bloodline and institution, rather than from intellect or results. His preferred candidate for Corps Command was Brudenell White, a Camberley graduate of Anglo-Irish stock who served as Birdwood's Chief of Staff. White was, by all accounts, an excellent staff officer, meticulous, reliable, respected. But he was a staff officer, not a combat commander. The distinction mattered, and it mattered precisely in the way Bean refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that Monash's battlefield competence outweighed White's institutional credentials. The prejudice that drove Bean's opposition was layered, and you have to understand all the layers to understand why it was so persistent. Anti-Semitism was the most explicit strand. The diary entries leave no room for doubt, but beneath it ran anti-German sentiment. During a war against Germany, Monash's German-speaking parents made him doubly suspect, and beneath that ran class prejudice, the deep institutional conviction that a militia officer and civil engineer, a man who had built bridges and poured concrete for a living, simply did not belong in command of what would become the largest corps on the Western Front. Bean wasn't alone. Keith Murdoch, yes, Rupert's father, was Australia's most powerful war correspondent. His cables reached 250 newspapers, and he threw his weight behind the campaign to stop Monash. On the 6th of June 1918, Murdoch made a direct approach to Monash himself. The offer was elegant in its poisonousness. Take the role of General Officer commanding the AIF in London, a senior title, prestige, an office far from the front, and in exchange, White would take operational command of the corps. Think about what that offer actually was. They were asking Monash to accept a promotion that was actually a removal, a title without power, a desk without a division. Monash saw through it immediately. He wrote to Prime Minister Billy Hughes, direct, no hedging. I have been made aware that there is a body of opinion in London led by Mr. Keith Murdoch. I wish to say that this is wholly misleading and absolutely incorrect. And then the line that tells you everything about the man. I want you to know I will not voluntarily forego this command. To his wife, he was blunter. It is a great nuisance to have to fight a pogrom of this nature in the midst of all one's other anxieties. A pogrom, his word, not mine. A Jewish man, in 1918, fighting a world war on one front and anti-Semitism on another, and he calls the second front what it is, a pogrom, and then goes back to planning a battle. Geoffrey Searle, who wrote the definitive biography of Monash, examined Bean's wartime diaries in detail and described them as thickly sprinkled with prejudiced impressions and harsh judgments of Monash. Searle believed this prejudice was the main reason Bean placed such a long embargo on the diary's release. Bean's great-grandson, Michael Bennett, later acknowledged that Bean's characterization of Monash as a pushy Jew was an expression of terrible intolerance. But here's the crucial detail that separates this from a simple story of bigotry triumphing. It didn't triumph. The military chain of command held firm. Brudenell White, the man Bean wanted in the job, refused to participate in the conspiracy. Twice he wrote to Monash to dissociate himself from Bean and Murdoch's schemes. Birdwood actively supported Monash's appointment and held firm under pressure. Haig had personally told Monash he wanted him as Corps Commander. When Hughes arrived in London on the 15th of June 1918, he found that, contrary to everything Murdoch and Bean had told him, Monash had overwhelming support from the people who actually understood war. Hughes formally approved the appointment on the 19th of June. Monash had the Australian Corps. Geoffrey Searle's verdict on the affair: it is perhaps the outstanding case of sheer irresponsibility by pressmen in Australian history. Former Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fischer went further. He compared it to the Dreyfus case. Bean, to his partial credit, eventually admitted what he'd done. In his 1957 book Two Men I Knew, he called his intervention high-intentioned but ill-judged, and acknowledged that those of us who took action did so without adequate appreciation of Monash, who was nevertheless a much greater man than most of us then thought. 39 years. It took him 39 years to write that sentence, and even then, high-intentioned does a lot of heavy lifting. Monash took command of the Australian Corps in late May 1918, and the first thing he did was something that tells you everything about how his mind worked. He didn't give a speech. He didn't tour the trenches, shaking hands. He sat down with maps, intelligence reports, logistics tables, and the Corps' maintenance schedules, and he started solving equations. The Western Front, by mid-1918, was a problem in industrial engineering. 3.5 years of stalemate had proven, at the cost of roughly 4 million dead, that courage alone couldn't break a fortified defensive position. The Somme had proven it: 57,000 British casualties on the first day alone, most of them in the first hour, most of them before they reached the German wire. Passchendaele had proven it: 275,000 casualties for 5 miles of mud. Verdun had proven it on the French side: 377,000 casualties for a few square kilometers around a fortress system that ended up roughly where it started. The physics were simple and brutal: a defender with interlocking machine gun fields, deep barbed wire, concrete strongpoints, and pre-registered artillery could destroy attacking infantry faster than it could cross the 200 to 800 meters of open ground between the trenches. Speed didn't help. Running men bunched together. Darkness didn't help. Flares turned night into day. Gas didn't help. The wind shifted. Courage was irrelevant to the equation. The brave died just as dead as the cowardly. Slightly sooner, if anything. Every solution tried by 1918 had addressed one piece of the problem while ignoring the rest. Artillery could suppress defenders, but the barrage moved on a fixed timetable, while infantry moved at the pace of the slowest man carrying the heaviest load through the deepest mud. Tanks could crush wire and silence machine guns, but they broke down, bogged, or were destroyed by artillery before they reached the objective. Aircraft could spot targets, but communication between air and ground was primitive. Each arm fought its own war. Nobody conducted the whole. Monash's insight was not romantic. It was mechanical. He wrote, "I had formed the gruesome view that the ghastly inefficiency of sending soldiers to fight machine guns with their breasts was a root cause of most of the failures in the war." His solution inverted the prevailing doctrine completely. Instead of infantry fighting forward and then receiving support, Monash proposed that every other arm, artillery, tanks, aircraft, machine guns, smoke, should fight the battle for the infantry. The infantry's job was to walk to its objective under maximum mechanical protection and then occupy the ground. He described his method with a metaphor that has become one of the most quoted passages in Australian military history. A perfected modern battle plan is like nothing so much as a score for an orchestral composition, where the various arms and units are the instruments and the tasks they perform are their respective musical phrases. An orchestra score, not a battle cry, not a call to arms, a score, written by an engineer. The objective Monash chose for his first operation as Corps Commander was modest in geography and colossal in ambition. The German-held village of Le Hamel and surrounding high ground on the Somme, roughly 17 kilometers east of Amiens. The salient exposed Allied troops to enfilading fire and gave the Germans observation over rear areas. Monash planned to straighten the line across a 6.5-kilometer front, advancing roughly 2 kilometers at the center. A limited bite, but the way he planned to take that bite would change warfare permanently. Planning consumed 2 weeks. On June 30th, Monash convened a final conference. 250 officers, 133 agenda items, 4.5 hours. Every arm, infantry, artillery, tanks, air, engineers, signals, medical, explained its plan in the presence of every other arm. Conflicts were identified and resolved in real time, and then Monash imposed a rule that no one had heard before. After this conference, no further changes were permitted. The plan was locked. Full-scale replicas of the German positions were built behind the lines. Battalions rehearsed the assault over and over, and Monash did something specific with the tanks that reveals his understanding of human psychology as well as engineering. The 4th Division, which would form a major part of the assault force, had been traumatized at Bullecourt in April 1917. That disaster needs a moment of explanation, because without understanding Bullecourt, you can't understand why what Monash did with the tanks at Hamel was so psychologically important. At first Bullecourt on the 11th of April 1917, 11 Mark II tanks were supposed to lead the 4th Brigade through the Hindenburg line wire. The tanks arrived late. Then they broke down or were destroyed by artillery fire almost immediately. The infantry, already exposed in no man's land, waiting for armor that wasn't coming, attacked without support and was slaughtered on unbroken wire. The brigade lost over 1,000 men. At 2nd Bullecourt in May, tanks again failed to deliver. The two battles combined cost the Australians roughly 10,000 casualties and created a relationship between Australian infantry and British tanks that ranged from deep skepticism to open hostility. Monash understood that telling traumatized soldiers to trust the machines that had got their mates killed was pointless. Words meant nothing against that memory. So he didn't use words, he let them drive them. Soldiers from the assault battalions were given joyrides in the new Mark V tanks, heavier, faster, more reliable than the Mark IIs that had failed at Bullecourt. They clambered over the machines, inspected the armor plate, talked to the crews, asked questions about reliability and speed. They painted their own battalion insignia on assigned vehicles. By the time the assault came, those tanks weren't War Office equipment sent down from above. They were 4th Division tanks, their tanks. The men who would walk behind them had touched them, sat inside them, and heard the crews explain exactly what the machines could and couldn't do. The combined arms integration at Hamel had no equivalent in the history of the Western Front. Not because any individual element was new, predicted artillery fire dated to Cambrai. Tank infantry cooperation had been attempted before. The Germans had tried aerial resupply during their spring offensives. What was new was the synchronization, everything working simultaneously, feeding into everything else, timed to the minute. Artillery, 628 guns, 302 heavy pieces and 326 field guns, organized into 16 brigades, plus over 100 Vickers machine guns, firing indirect barrages. Together, they would expend roughly 132,000 rounds in 90 minutes. The creeping barrage advanced at 100 yards every 3 minutes, with infantry following 75 yards behind the curtain of steel. At the intermediate objective line, a 10-minute pause allowed consolidation before the barrage resumed at a slower pace. 100 yards every 4 minutes. All fire was predicted. No ranging shots, no warning. Tanks, 60 Mark V tanks, their combat debut, plus 4 supply carriers, organized under the 5th Tank Brigade commanded by Brigadier General Anthony Courage. Monash placed tanks under infantry commander's control. This was radical. In every previous British tank operation, tank commanders had run their own show. At Hamel, an infantryman could bang on a tank's hull and point to a machine gun nest. The tank would deal with it. Monash's instruction to tank crews was characteristically blunt. It is the primary duty of the tanks to save casualties to the Australian infantry. The 4 carrier tanks each hauled 4.5 tons of materiel, barbed wire, water, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition, corrugated iron, directly to captured objectives. This replaced the labour of roughly 1,200 carrying parties. Soldiers who would otherwise have been hauling supplies forward under fire were now free to fight. Aircraft performed 5 distinct roles. On the night of July 3rd to 4th, 144 aircraft dropped over 1,100 bombs on Hamel village, while their engine noise masked the sound of 60 tanks moving to assembly areas. At H hour, No. 101 Squadron dropped 350 bombs east of the front to cover the tank's final approach. After the assault, No. 9 Squadron RAF executed what was the first coordinated aerial resupply in a combined arms plan. Parachutes designed by Captain Lawrence Wackett dropped 93 boxes containing 111,600 rounds of small arms ammunition to forward troops. Machine gun crews spread large V-shaped canvas markers on the ground to guide the pilots. No. 3, Squadron AFC, Australian Flying Corps, photographed the new front line from 4:45 and delivered updated maps to divisional headquarters within minutes. And then there was the gas deception. For 2 weeks before the attack, artillery fired gas mixed with smoke at approximately 4 in the morning every day. The Germans learned to expect it. On the morning of the assault, only smoke was fired, no gas. Australian troops advanced freely, while German defenders fumbled with restrictive gas masks that degraded their vision and made communication nearly impossible. Every element feeding into every other element. An orchestra score. But before the orchestra could play, one instrument nearly walked off the stage. Monash had deliberately chosen July 4th, American Independence Day, as the attack date. He integrated 10 companies, roughly 2,000 troops, from the US 33rd Division's 131st and 132nd Infantry regiments into his assault formations. Each American platoon was embedded within an Australian company. The arrangement served 2 purposes. It gave the Americans their first combat experience under the guidance of veterans, and it compensated for Australian manpower shortages. The 42nd Battalion, for instance, had been reduced from 1,027 men to just 433. On July 2nd, General John J. Pershing learned of the arrangement during a visit to US 2 Corps headquarters. Pershing's principle was absolute, and it was not negotiable. American soldiers would fight under American command or not at all. He advised General Reed that Americans should not participate. The next morning, he telephoned with what the records describe as further and positive instructions. All American troops were to be withdrawn. 6 of the 10 companies were pulled back on the 3rd of July. Then, at approximately 4 in the afternoon on the 3rd of July, barely 11 hours before H hour, a further order reached Monash through Rawlinson's headquarters. Not just the remaining 4 companies, all Americans, every single one. Monash had spent 2 weeks integrating these men into his assault formations. They had trained together, rehearsed together, learned each other's signals. Pulling them out now wouldn't just reduce his numbers. It would tear holes in the fabric of the assault plan at the worst possible moment. He went to Rawlinson. The exchange, recorded in Peter Noonan's account, is extraordinary. Rawlinson: "You don't realize what it means. Do you want me to run the risk of being sent back to England? Do you mean it is worth that?" Monash: "Yes, I do. It is more important to keep the confidence of the Americans and Australians in each other than to preserve even an army commander." Think about what Monash just said. He told his own army commander, the man who controlled his career, his command, his future, that the integrity of the battle plan mattered more than Rawlinson's job, more than Monash's own job, more than the political relationship between Britain and America. Rawlinson, to his credit, conditionally backed Monash, provided Haig didn't countermand by 7 that evening. Just before the deadline, Haig called. He had directed the withdrawal in deference to the wish of General Pershing. But, and this is the crucial qualifier, the attack must be launched as prepared, even if a few American detachments cannot be got out before 0 hour. Diplomatically phrased permission to proceed, Monash's gamble had worked. approximately 1,000 Americans from 4 companies, C and E of the 131st Infantry, A and G of the 132nd Infantry, went over the top at Hamel under an Australian Corps commander. Some individual Americans from withdrawn units reportedly donned Australian tunics and stayed anyway. 3:02 in the morning, 4th of July, 1918, the Australian line. The Somme Valley is damp and cool, mist sits in the low ground. Behind the front, 60 tanks idle in their assembly areas, engines ticking with heat, crews running through final checks. 7,000 men wait in jumping-off trenches, bayonets fixed, watches synchronised, each man knowing his objective, his route, and the name of the tank assigned to support his platoon. At 03:02, artillery opened with what the Germans believed was the habitual harassing fire. Routine. The defenders in their positions along the Hamel Spur reached for gas masks. Routine. They had done this every morning for 2 weeks. At 3:10, 8-hour, the world ended. The full weight of 628 guns, 100 plus Vickers, and trench mortars crashed onto German positions simultaneously. The sound was physical, a wall of concussion that compressed the air and shook the chalk. The creeping barrage began 4 minutes later, a curtain of high explosive and shrapnel rolling forward across the German positions at 100 yards every 3 minutes. Roughly 7,000 Allied troops rose along the entire 6.5-kilometer front and walked into mist, smoke, and churned earth. Visibility dropped to about 20 yards. Compass bearings and the barrage itself were the only guides. The assault force comprised elements of 3 Australian brigades, the 4th Brigade from the 4th Division, the 11th Brigade from the 3rd Division, and the 6th Brigade from the 2nd Division, plus those 1,000 Americans. A diversionary feint by the 15th Brigade north of the Somme against Ville-sur-Ancre fixed German reserves in place. Fighting was fiercest at Pear Trench, where the artillery had fallen short and left wire intact. The infantry arrived to find the obstacle unbroken, the German machine guns behind it very much alive. In previous years on this front, that would have meant slaughter. Men piling up against wire while traversing fire cut them apart. But at Hamel, a Mark 5 tank ground forward, crushed the wire flat, and suppressed the guns while infantry worked around the flanks. The system worked. Even so, individual actions decided local outcomes. Private Henry Dalziel, 15th Battalion, charged a machine gun position with a revolver, killed or wounded the crew, kept going, charged a second position, was wounded, kept going again. He was 25 years old, from Irvine Bank in far north Queensland, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross. At Kidney Trench, Lance Corporal Thomas Axford, 16th Battalion, went through a German position alone, grenades first, then bayonet. 10 Germans killed, 6 captured, another VC. Axford was a farm labourer from Carryton, South Australia. He was 24. In Hamel village itself, the 43rd Battalion fought house by house. 1 platoon, with attached Americans, killed 15 Germans and captured 40 in a single action. After a 10-minute consolidation pause at the intermediate line, the barrage resumed. The tanks, slightly delayed by darkness in the early phase, now came fully into their own. They hugged the creeping barrage, crushed machine gun positions, and pushed 1,000 meters beyond the Allied line to harass German rear areas and discourage counterattack. By approximately 0443, 93 minutes after H hour, every objective on the entire front had been secured, every single one. The numbers tell the story that adjectives can't. Australian casualties totaled approximately 1,062 killed and wounded combined, including the diversionary operation. American casualties numbered approximately 176, with an estimated 13 to 26 killed. German losses were roughly 2,000 killed or wounded, with 1,600 captured during the battle and an additional 700 prisoners taken overnight. Allied troops seized 177 machine guns, 32 trench mortars, and 73,000 rounds of recaptured British ammunition. Only 3 of 60 tanks failed to reach their objectives. The territory recovered was, as Monash noted in his report, more than 4 times what was customarily allotted as a divisional objective in the pitched battles of 1917, and he had achieved it with less than one division in 93 minutes, with casualties that would have been considered miraculous by the standards of the Somme or Passchendaele. The Americans performed with what Australian reports described as excessive keenness and dash. Some had advanced so eagerly they'd pushed into the creeping barrage, a hazard of enthusiasm rather than error. Corporal Thomas A. Pope of E Company, 131st Infantry, earned the Medal of Honor, the first awarded to an American in the war, when he single-handedly rushed an enemy machine gun position during a German counterattack on July 5th. 14 Americans received British decorations. 8 received the Distinguished Service Cross. Pershing's response was characteristically firm. He acknowledged the Americans' splendid behavior, but wrote that Hamel's immediate effect was to cause me to make the instructions so positive that nothing of the kind could occur again. The episode reinforced his determination to build an independent American fighting force, contributing directly to the formation of the US First Army the following month. The 33rd Division remains the only US Army division to have fought as part of both British and French Corps during the war, a distinction that owes everything to Monash's refusal to back down on the night of July 3rd. But notice what Pershing didn't say. He didn't say the operation was flawed. He didn't say the Americans shouldn't have fought. He didn't say Monash was wrong. He said it must never happen again, because Hamel proved that Americans could fight effectively under foreign command, and that was a precedent Pershing could not allow to stand. From his perspective, the success was actually worse than failure would have been. Failure would have justified keeping Americans separate. Success proved they could integrate, and integration was precisely what Pershing's entire strategic vision was designed to prevent. Monash, characteristically, drew a different lesson. The Americans had fought well because they had been properly trained, properly integrated, and properly led. The principle wasn't national, it was professional. Good soldiers, well prepared, perform well regardless of the flag on their shoulder. This was an engineer's conclusion, not a politician's, and it was correct. British GHQ circulated the Hamel plan as a staff brochure, not a commendation, not a footnote in a report, a brochure, a how-to manual for every corps on the Western Front. Monash applied the same principles at massively greater scale 5 weeks later, the Battle of Hamel, August 8, 1918. The Australian Corps spearheaded the attack alongside Currie's Canadian Corps. They advanced 12 kilometers in a single day, one of the greatest advances of the entire war. Half of the 16,000 German prisoners fell to the Australians. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. 4 days after Amiens, King George V arrived at the Chateau de Bethangle and knighted Monash on the steps, with captured German guns arranged in a semicircle. It was reportedly the first battlefield knighting by a British monarch in 200 years. The Jewish engineer from West Melbourne, the man Bean called a pushy Jew, knelt before his king surrounded by the evidence of his competence. The Battle of Mont Saint-Quentin at the end of August may have been Monash's most audacious operation. He had no tanks. His battalions were reduced to 60 or 70 rifles per company. The objective was a fortified hilltop commanding Peronne, held by the German 2nd Guards Division. Rawlinson was skeptical. Monash convinced him. 2 understrength battalions charged uphill. Monash reportedly ordered them to scream like bushrangers. At a cost of 3,000 casualties across 3 days, they shattered 5 German divisions and forced a general withdrawal to the Hindenburg line. Rawlinson, the same man who had worried about being sent back to England, called the 31st of August to the 4th of September advance the greatest military achievement of the war. 8 Victoria Crosses were awarded in 3 days for the assault on the Hindenburg line itself at the St. Quentin Canal on September 29th. Monash deployed some 1,600 guns, firing nearly 1 million shells. American troops from the 27th and 30th Divisions formed the vanguard, with Australian divisions exploiting the breach. The operation was complicated. Thick fog caused confusion. Americans overran German positions without clearing them, forcing Australians to fight for ground that should already have been taken. But by October 2nd, a 17-kilometer breach had been opened in the line the Germans considered impregnable. On October 5th, 1918, the Australian Corps fought its last infantry action at Mont. The 5 Australian divisions were withdrawn, exhausted, under strength but unbroken. They were heading back toward the line when the armistice came on the 11th of November. From Hamel to the armistice, 130 days. And the man who orchestrated the Australian contribution to those 100 days was the man Charles Bean had tried to stop. Military historians have debated Monash's exact place in the pantheon for a century now, and the assessments range from extraordinary to slightly less extraordinary. Field Marshal Montgomery delivered the most celebrated verdict. I would name Sir John Monash as the best general on the Western Front in Europe. He possessed real creative originality, and the war might well have been over sooner, and certainly with fewer casualties, had Haig been relieved of his command, and Monash appointed in his place. A J.P. Taylor called him the only general of creative originality produced by the First World War. B.H. Little Hart wrote in his 1931 obituary that Monash had probably the greatest capacity for command in modern war amongst all who held command. Serious historians offer more calibrated assessments, and they should. Geoffrey Searle acknowledged that Monash perhaps won more than his fair share of fame, because he had the great luck to take command just as the tide turned decisively, but added that the task could hardly have been better done. Australian War Memorial senior historian Aaron Pogrom notes that the popular view of Monash as the inventor of combined arms tactics overlooks the British expeditionary force-wide idea-sharing that produced them. None of the individual elements at Hamel were entirely new. Predicted fire dated to Cambrai. Tank infantry cooperation had been attempted before. The Germans had tried aerial resupply during their spring offensives, and the claim that Hamel directly spawned blitzkrieg is considered an overstatement by most serious scholars. A WM researcher, Ellen Cresswell, describes R.A. Beaumont's 1967 assertion that, at Hamel, the seeds of the blitzkrieg were sown as an outlandish claim. The indirect connections exist. Fuller's and Liddell Hart's interwar writings on mechanized warfare drew partly on 1918's lessons, but blitzkrieg involved operational level maneuver and encirclement far beyond anything attempted on the Somme in July 1918. What is not debated is what Monash actually did. He was the first commander with the capacity, imagination, and engineering discipline to synchronize every available element of military force into a single, coherent system and execute it with devastating precision. Others had the pieces. Monash wrote the score. Monash returned to Australia as the country's most celebrated soldier. He managed the demobilization of the AIF, a massive logistical operation involving the repatriation of nearly 170,000 men across 3 continents, and approached it with the same systematic thoroughness he'd applied to Hamel. Timetables, staging areas, medical processing, education programs for soldiers waiting for transport. He treated it as an engineering problem because it was one, and because that was the only way he knew how to think. Then he went back to civilian life. Not politics, though he was courted. Not a military sinecure, though he was offered them. He became chairman of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, overseeing the development of the Latrobe Valley brown coal industry, building the power infrastructure that would drive Victoria's industrial growth for the next half-century. An engineer to the end. A man who built things. He died on the 8th of October 1931, aged 66. 250,000 people lined the streets of Melbourne for his funeral, the largest in Australian history to that point, and a figure that has not been exceeded since. Jewish, Christian, and secular mourners, veterans who had served under him, politicians who had argued with him, engineers who had worked beside him, ordinary citizens who had never met him, but who understood, in some instinctive way, what he represented. The man the establishment had tried to sideline drew 250,000 people to say goodbye. Bean outlived him by 37 years. He spent those decades writing the official history, 6 volumes that shaped how Australia understood its war, and in those volumes, Monash receives competent treatment, fair even. But the private diaries tell a different story. and Bean knew it. The embargo he placed on the diaries ensured that the full extent of his prejudice wouldn't surface until long after both men were dead. Monash appears on Australia's $100 note. His name graces one of the country's major universities. His face is the one Australians see when they handle their highest denomination banknote. The Jewish engineer from West Melbourne, the militia officer, the man who was not from the right family, the right religion, the right class. Montgomery's verdict is the one that sticks, and it sticks because it captures something beyond military assessment. The best general on the Western Front was not a cavalryman who could inspire a charge. He was an engineer who could orchestrate complexity. He didn't ask his infantry to be heroes. He built a system that made heroism unnecessary. 93 minutes, an orchestra score written by a man half the establishment thought had no right to hold the baton. And when the music stopped, every objective had fallen, the method had been proven, and the men who had tried to stop him had nothing left to say. That is the answer to Charles Bean's diary.